Uh, okay, I started.
Good morning. I just got off of a Google Meet with all of the teachers from Drummond and the administration, and they all send their hellos to everybody. It was wonderful to see everybody and all of their faces, and to hear about all the things that they're doing with their classrooms. Something from yesterday that really I forgot to touch on that I thought was really interesting is when Meg explains to Calvin how to solve, all you have to remember is that every ordinary fraction can be converted into an infinite periodic decimal fraction. That sounds very complicated, but essentially what she does is she says 3/7 is what percent? Be interested to know if you can solve that. 3/7 is what percent? Then convert that into a decimal. And that is exactly what Meg was showing Calvin. That 3/7 may be hard to imagine and kind of work with, but if you just think of it as a decimal, it becomes very simple and straightforward. So I just thought that was interesting. All right, chapter 4, the black thing. The trees were lashed into a violent frenzy. Meg screamed and clutched at Calvin. Mrs. Witch's authoritative voice called out, "Quiet, children, child." Did a shadow fall across the moon, or did the moon simply go out, extinguish as abruptly and completely as a candle? There was still the sound of leaves, a terrified, terrifying rushing. All light was gone. Darkness was complete. Suddenly the wind was gone and all sound. Meg felt that Calvin was being torn from her. When she reached out for him, her fingers touched nothing. She screamed out, "Charles!" And whether it was to help him or for him to help her, she did not know. The word was flung back into her throat and she choked on it. She was completely alone. She had lost the protection of Calvin's hand. Charles was nowhere either to save or to turn to. She was alone in a fragment of nothingness. No light, no sound, no feeling. Where was her body? She tried to move in her panic, but there was nothing to move. Just as light and sound had vanished, she was gone too. The corporeal Meg simply was not. Then she felt her limbs again. Her legs and arms were tingling faintly as though they had been asleep. She blinked her eyes rapidly, but though she herself was somehow back, nothing else was. It was not as simple as darkness or absence of light. Darkness has a tangible quality. It can be moved through and felt. In darkness, you can bark your shins. The world of things still exists around you. She was lost in a horrifying void. It was the same way with the silence. There was more than silence. A deaf person can feel vibrations. Here, there was nothing to feel. Suddenly, she was aware of her heart beating rapidly within the cage of her ribs. Had it stopped before? What had made it start again? The tingling in her arms and legs grew stronger, and suddenly she felt movement. The movement she felt must be the turning of the earth, rotating on its axis, traveling its elliptic course around the sun. And this feeling of moving with the earth was somewhat like the feeling of being in the ocean, out in the ocean beyond this rising and falling of the breakers, lying on the moving water, pulsing gently with the swells, and feeling a gentle, inexorable tug of the moon. I'm asleep. I'm dreaming, she thought. I'm having a nightmare. I want to wake up. Let me wake up. Well, Charles Wald's voice said, that was quite a trip. I do think you might have warned us. Light began to pulse and quiver. Meg blinked and shoved shakily at her glasses, and there was Charles Wallace standing indignantly in front of her, his hands on his hips. Meg, he shouted. Calvin, where are you? She saw Charles. She heard him, but she could not go to him. She could not shove through the strange, trembling light to meet him. Calvin's voice came as though it were pushing through a cloud. Well, just give me time, will you? I'm older than you are. Meg gasped. It wasn't that Calvin wasn't there and then that he was. It wasn't that part of him came first and then the rest of him followed, like a hand, and then an arm, an eye, and then a nose. It was a sort of shimmering, looking at Calvin through water, through smoke, through fire, and then there he was, solid and reassuring. Meg! Charles Wallace's voice came. Meg! Calvin, where's Meg? I'm right here, she tried to say, but her voice seemed to be caught at its source. Meg! Calvin cried, and he turned around, looking about wildly. Mrs. Witch, you haven't left Meg behind, have you? Charles Wallace shouted. If you've hurt Meg, any of you, Calvin started, but suddenly Meg felt a violent push and shattering as though she had been thrust through a wall of glass. Ah, there you are, Charles Wallace said and rushed over to her and hugged her. But where am I? Meg asked breathlessly, relieved to hear that her voice was now coming out of her in more or less a normal way. She looked around rather wildly. They were standing in a sunlit field, and the air about them was moving with the delicious fragrance that comes only on the rarest of spring days when the sun's touch is gentle and the apple blossoms are just beginning to unfold. She pushed her glasses up to her nose and to reassure herself that what she was seeing was real. They had left the silver glint of biting autumn evening, and now around them everything was golden with light. The grasses of the field were a tender new green, and scattered about were tiny multicolored flowers. Meg turned slowly to face a mountain reaching so high into the sky that its peak was lost in a crown of puffy white clouds. From the trees at the base of the mountain came a sudden singing of birds. There was an air of such ineffable peace and joy all around her that her heart's wild thumping slowed. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Came Mrs. Who's voice. Suddenly the three of them were there. Mrs. Whatsit in her pink stole askew, Mrs. Who with her spectacles gleaming, and Mrs. Witch, still a little more than a shimmer. Delicate multicolored butterflies were fluttering about them, as though in greeting. Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who began to giggle, and they giggled until it seemed that whatever their private joke was, they would fall down with the wild fun of it. The shimmer seemed to be laughing too. It became vaguely darker and more solid, and then there appeared a figure in a black robe and a black peaked hat, beady eyes and a beaked nose, and long gray hair. One bony claw clutched a broomstick. Well, just to keep you girls happy, the strange voice said, and Mrs. Whatsit and Mrs. Who fell into each other's arms in gales of laughter. Do you know why they're laughing? No?
No.
The shimmer that is Mrs. Witch came finally into focus, and she is wearing a long black robe, a black peaked hat, has beady eyes and a beaked nose, and long gray hair, and clutching a broomstick. Why do you think they're laughing?
Because it looks like a giant bird with a broomstick?
Yeah, well, because she looks like an actual witch. Like, her name is spelled like, which of these would you like? But in a kind of a twist as a joke,
she
actually looks like a witch. And so that's why Mrs. Who and Mrs. Whatsit are dying of laughter. And apparently she's doing it just to amuse them. If you ladies have had your fun, I think we should tell Calvin and Meg a little more about all this, Charles Wallace said coldly. You scared Meg half out of her wits, whisking her off this way without any warning. Vinx erunt animi, raro et perpaqua loquentis, Mrs. Who intoned. Horace, to action little, less to words incline. Mrs. Who, I wish you'd stop quoting. Charles Wallace sounded very annoyed. Mrs. Whatsit adjusted her stole. But she finds it so difficult to verbalize, Charles dear. It helps her if she can quote instead of working out words on her own. And we mustn't lose our sense of humor, Mrs. Witch said. The only way to cope with something deadly serious is to try to treat it a little lightly. But that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard for Meg, Mrs. Whatsit said. It's going to be harder for her to realize that we are serious. What about me? Calvin said. The life of your father isn't at stake, Mrs. Whatsit told him. What about Charles Wallace then? Mrs. Whatsit's unoiled, door-hinged voice was warm with affection and pride. Charles Wallace knows that it's far more than just the life of his father. Charles Wallace knows what's at stake. But remember, Mrs. Who said, nothing is hopeless. We must hope for everything. Euripides. Where are we now, and how did we get here? Calvin asked. Uriel, the third planet of the star Moloch and the spiral nebula Messier 101. This I'm supposed to believe, Calvin asked indignantly. As you like, Mrs. Witch said coldly. For some reason, Meg felt that Mrs. Witch, despite her looks and ephemeral broomstick, was someone in whom one could put complete trust. It doesn't seem any more peculiar than anything else that's happened. Well then, someone just tell me how we got here? Calvin's voice was still angry, and his freckles seemed to stand out on his face. Even traveling at the speed of light, it would take us years and years to get here. Oh, we don't travel at the speed of anything, Mrs. Whatsit explained earnestly. We tesser, or you might say, we wrinkle. Clear as mud, Calvin said. Tesser, Meg thought. Could that have anything to do with Mother's tesseract? She was about to ask when Mrs. Witch started to speak, and one did not interrupt when Mrs. Witch was speaking. Mrs. Whatsit is young and naive. She keeps thinking she can explain things in words, Mrs. Who said. Quoi plus ça, plus c'est-on. French, you know. The more a man knows, the less he talks. But she has to use words for Meg and Calvin, Charles reminded Mrs. Who. If he brought them along, they have a right to know what's going on. Meg went up to Mrs. Witch. In the intensity of her question, she'd forgotten all about the tesseract. Is my father here? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not here, Meg. Let Mrs. Whatsit explain. She is younger, and the language of words is easier for her than it is for Mrs. Who and me. We stopped here, Mrs. Whatsit explained, more or less to catch our breaths and to give you a chance to know what you're up against. But what about Father, Meg asked. Is he all right? For the moment, love, yes. He's one of the reasons we're here. But you see, he's only one. Well, where is he? Please take me to him. We can't. Not yet, Charles said. You have to be patient, Meg. But I'm not patient, Meg cried passionately. I've never been patient. Mrs. Who's glasses shone at her gently. If you want to help your father, then you must learn patience. Vitam in pendre vero. To stake one's life for the truth. That is what we must do. This is what your father was doing, Mrs. Whatsit nodded, her voice, like Mrs. Who's, very serious and very solemn. And then she smiled her radiant smile. Now, why don't you three children wander around and Charles can explain things a little? You're perfectly safe on Uriel. That's why we stopped here to rest. But aren't you coming with us? Meg asked fearfully. There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Witch raised her authoritative hand. Show them, she said to Mrs. Whatsit, and at something in her voice, Meg felt prickles of apprehension. Now? Mrs. Whatsit asked, her creaky voice rising to a squeak. Whatever it was Mrs. Witch wanted them to see, it was something that made Mrs. Whatsit uncomfortable too. Now, Mrs. Witch said, they may as well know. Should I change? Mrs. Whatsit asked. Better. I hope it won't upset the children too much, Mrs. Whatsit murmured as though to herself. Should I change too? Mrs. Who asked. Oh, but I've had fun in these clothes. But I'll have to admit Mrs. Whatsit is the best at it. Das Werk lobt den Meister, German. The work proves the craftsman. Shall I transform now too? Mrs. Witch shook her head. Not yet. Not here. You may wait. Now, don't be frightened, loves, Mrs. Whatsit said. Her plump little body began to shimmer, to quiver, to shift. The wild colors of her clothes became muted, whitened. The pudding bag shape stretched out, lengthened, and merged, and suddenly before the children was a creature more beautiful than any Meg had ever imagined. And the beauty lay in far more than the outward description. Outwardly, Mrs. Whatsit was surely no longer a Mrs. Whatsit. She was a marble white body with powerful flanks, something like a horse, but at the same time completely unlike a horse. For from the magnificently modeled back sprang a nobly formed torso, arms and a head resembling a man's, but a man with the perfection of dignity and virtue, an exaltation of joy such as Meg had never before seen. No, she thought, it's not like a Greek centaur, not in the least. From the shoulders, slowly, a pair of wings unfolded, wings made of rainbows, of light upon water, of poetry.
Centaur Pegasus.
Yeah, like a centaur Pegasus. Are you picturing it in your mind?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So cool.
Yeah. Calvin fell to his knees. No, Mrs. Whatsit said, though her voice voice was not Mrs. Whatsit's voice. Not to me, Calvin. Never to me. Stand up. Carry them, Mrs. Witch commanded. With a gesture both delicate and strong, Mrs. Whatsit knelt in front of the children, stretching her wings wide and holding them steady but quivering. On to my back now, the new voice said. The children took hesitant steps toward the beautiful creature. But what do we call you now? Calvin asked. Oh, my dears, came the new voice, a rich voice with the warmth of woodwind, the clarity of a trumpet, the mystery of an English horn. You can't go on changing my name each time I metamorphose. I've had such pleasure being Mrs. Whatsit. I think you'd better keep to that. She, he, it smiled at them, and the radiance of the smile was as tangible as a soft breeze, as directly warming as the rays of the sun. Come, Charles Wallace clambered up. Meg and Calvin followed him, Meg sitting between the two boys. A tremor went through the great wings, and then Mrs. Whatsit lifted and they were moving through the air. Meg soon found that there was no need to cling to Charles Wallace or Calvin. The giant creature's flight was serenely smooth. The boys were eagerly looking around the landscape. Look, Charles Wallace pointed. The mountains are so tall that you can't see where they end. Meg looked upward, and indeed the mountains seemed to be reaching into infinity. They left the fertile fields and flew across a great plateau of granite-like rock, shaped into enormous monoliths. These had a definite rhythmic form, but they were not statues. They were like nothing Meg had ever seen before, and she wondered if they had been made by wind and weather, by the formation of this earth, or if they were a creation of being like the one on which they rode. They left the great granite plain and flew over a garden, even more beautiful than anything in a dream. In it were gathered many creatures like the one Mrs. Whatsit had become. Some lying among the flowers, some swimming in a broad crystal river that flowed through the garden, some flying in what Meg was sure must be a kind of dance, moving in and out above the trees. They were making music, music that came not only from their throats, but from the movement of their great wings as well. What are they singing? Meg asked excitedly. Mrs. Whatsit shook her beautiful head. It won't go into your words. I can't possibly transfer it to your words. Are you getting any of it, Charles? Charles Wallace sat very still on the broad back, on his face an intensely listening look, the look he had when he delved into Meg or his mother. A little, but just a very little. But I think I could get more in time. Yes, you could learn it, Charles, but there isn't time. We can only stay here long enough to rest up and make a few preparations. Meg hardly listened to her. I want to know what they're saying. I want to know what it means. Try, Charles, Mrs. Whatsit urged. Try to translate. You can let yourself go now. You don't have to hold back. But I can't, Charles Wallace cried in an anguished voice. I don't know enough. Not yet. Then try to work with me and I'll see if I can't verbalize it a little for them. Charles Wallace got his look of probing, of listening. I know that look, Meg thought suddenly. Now I think I know what it means, because I've had it myself sometimes, doing math with Father when a problem is just about to come clear. Mrs. Whatsit seemed to be listening to Charles's thoughts. Well, yes, that's an idea I can try. Too bad you don't really know it, so you can give it to me direct, Charles. It's so much more work this way. Don't be lazy, Charles said. Mrs. Whatsit did not take offense. She explained, Oh, it's my favorite kind of work, Charles. That's why they chose me to go along, even though I'm so much younger. It's my one real talent, but it takes a tremendous amount of energy, and we're going to need every ounce of energy for what's ahead of us, but I'll try. For Calvin and Meg, I'll try. She was silent, and the great wings almost stopped moving. Only a delicate stirring seemed to keep them aloft. Listen, then, Mrs. Whatsit said. The resonant voice rose, and the words seemed to be all around them, so that Meg felt that she could almost reach out and touch them. Sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of the earth. Ye that go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isles and the inhabitants thereof. Let the wilderness and the cities thereof lift their voices. Let the inhabitants of the rocks sing. Let them shout from the top of the mountains. Let them give glory unto the Lord. Throughout her entire body, Meg felt a pulse of joy, such as she had never known before. Calvin's hand reached out He did not clasp her hand in his, but moved his fingers so that they were barely touching hers. But joy flowed through them, back and forth between them, around them, and about them, and inside them. When Mrs. Whatsit sighed, it seemed completely incomprehensible that through this bliss should come the faintest whisper of doubt. "We must go now, children." Mrs. Voice was deep with sadness. May could not understand. Raising her head, Mrs. Whatsit gave a call that seemed to be a command, and one of the creatures flying above the trees nearest them raised its head to listen, and then flew off and picked 3 flowers from a tree growing near the river and brought them over. "Each of you take one," Mrs. Whatsit said. "I'll tell you how to use them later." As Meg took her flowers, she realized that it was not a single blossom, but hundreds of tiny flowers forming a kind of hollow bell. "Where are we going?" Calvin asked. "Up." The wings moved steadily, swiftly. The garden was left behind, the stretch of granite, the mighty shapes, and then Mrs. Whatsit was flying upward, climbing steadily up, up. Below them, the trees of the mountain dwindled and became sparse, were replaced by bushes, and then small dry grasses, and then vegetation ceased entirely, and there were only rocks, points, and peaks of sharp and dangerous. "Hold on tight," Mrs. Whatsit said. "Don't slip." Meg felt Calvin's arms circle her waist in a secure hold. Still they moved upward. Now they were in clouds. They could see nothing but drifting whiteness, and the moisture clung to them in condensed and icy droplets. As Meg shivered, Calvin's grip tightened. In front of her, Charles Wallace sat quietly. Once he turned just long enough to give her a swift glance of tenderness and concern, but Meg felt as each moment passed that he was growing farther and farther away, that he was becoming less and less her adored baby brother, and more one with whatever kind of being Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which in actuality were. Abruptly, they burst out into the clouds of the shaft of light. Below them, there were still rocks, and above them the rocks continued to reach up into the sky, but now, though it seemed miles upward, May could see where the mountains at last came to an end. Mrs. Whatsit continued to climb, her wings straining a little. Meg felt her heart racing. Cold sweat began to gather on her face, and her lips felt as though they were turning blue. She began to gasp. "All right, children, use your flowers now," Mrs. Whatsit said. "The atmosphere will continue to get thinner from now on. Hold the flowers up to your face and breathe through them, and they will give you enough oxygen. It won't be as much as you're used to, but it will be enough." Meg had almost forgotten the flowers and was grateful to realize that she was still clasping them, that she hadn't let them fall from her fingers. She pressed her face into the blossoms and breathed deeply. Calvin still held her with one arm, but he too held the flowers to his face. Charles Wallace moved the hand with the flowers slowly, almost as though he were in a dream. Mrs. Whatsit's wings strained against the thinness of the atmosphere. The summit was only a little way above them, and then they were there. Mrs. Whatsit came to rest on a small plateau of smooth, silvery rock. There, ahead of them, was a great white disk. "One of Uriel's moons," Mrs. Whatsit told them, her mighty voice faintly breathless. "Oh, it's beautiful," May cried. "It's beautiful." The silver light from the enormous moon poured over them, blending with the golden quality of the day, flowing over the children, over Mrs. Whatsit, over the mountain peak. "Now we will turn around," Mrs. Whatsit said, and at the quality of her voice, Meg was afraid again. But when they turned, she saw nothing. Ahead of them was the thin, clear blue of sky, below them the rocks thrusting in the shifting sea of white clouds. "Now we will wait," Mrs. Whatsit said, "for sunset and moonset." Almost as she spoke, the light began to deepen, to darken. "I want to watch the moonset," Charles Wallace said. "No, child, do not turn around, any of you. Face out toward the dark. What I have to show you will become more visible then. Look ahead, straight ahead, as far as you can possibly look." Meg's eyes ached from the strain of looking and seeing nothing. Then, above the clouds which encircled the mountain, she seemed to see a shadow, a faint thing of darkness, so far off that she was scarcely sure she was really seeing it. Charles Wallace said, "What's that?" "That sort of shadow out there," Calvin gestured. "What is it?" "I don't like it." "Watch," Mrs. Whatsit commanded.
I don't like it.
It was a shadow, nothing but a shadow. It was not even as tangible as a cloud. Was it cast by something? Or was it a thing in itself? The sky darkened. The gold left the light, and they were surrounded by blue, blue deepening until there had been nothing but the evening sky there was now a faint pulse of a star, and then another, and another, and another. There were more stars than Meg had ever seen before. The atmosphere is so thin here, Mrs. Whatsit said, as though in answer to her unasked question, that it does not obscure your vision as it would at home. Now look straight ahead. Meg looked. The dark shadow was still there. It had not lessened or dispersed with the coming of night, and where the shadow was, the stars were not visible. Would you mind not muttering into yourself? Thanks. What could there be about a shadow that was so terrible that she knew that there had never been before, or ever would be again, anything that would chill her with a fear that was beyond shuddering, beyond crying or screaming, beyond the possibility of comfort? Meg's hand holding the blossom slowly dropped, and it seemed as though a knife gashed through her lungs. She gasped, but there was no air for her to breathe. Darkness glazed her eyes and mind, but as she started to fall into unconsciousness, her head dropped down into the flowers, which was still clutching, and as she inhaled the fragrance of their purity, her mind and body revived, and she sat up again. The shadow was still there, dark and dreadful. Calvin held her hand strongly in his, but she felt neither strength nor reassurance in his touch. Beside her, a tremor went through Charles Wallace, but he sat very still. You shouldn't be seeing this, Meg thought. This is too much for so little a boy, no matter how different and extraordinary a little boy. Calvin turned, rejecting the dark thing that blotted out the light of the stars. Make it go away, Mrs. Whatsit, he whispered. Make it go away. It's evil. Slowly, the great creature turned around so that the shadow was behind them, so that they saw only the stars unobscured, the soft throb of starlight on the mountains, the descending circle of the great moon swiftly slipping over the horizon. Then, without a word from Mrs. Whatsit, they were traveling down. When they reached the corona of clouds, Mrs. Whatsit said, "You can breathe without flowers now, my children." Silence again, not a word. It was though the shadow had somehow reached out with its dark power and touched them so that they were incapable of speech. When they got back to the flowery field, bathed now in sunlight and moonlight from another small, yellower rising moon, a little of the tenseness went out of their bodies, and they realized that the body of the beautiful creature on which they rode had been as rigid as theirs. With a graceful gesture, it dropped to the ground and folded its great wings. Charles Wallace was the first to slide off. "Mrs. Who? Mrs. Which?" he called, and there was an immediate quivering in the air. Mrs. Who's familiar glasses gleamed at them. Mrs. Which appeared too, but as she had last told the children, it was difficult for her to materialize completely. And though there was a robe and peaked hat, May could look through them to the mountain and stars. She slid off Mrs. Watson's back and walked rather unsteadily after the long ride over to Mrs. Which. "The dark thing," she said. "We saw," she said. "Is that what my father is fighting?" I noticed you heard something that made you stop and laugh for a second towards the end there. Something about the clouds, did you?
The corona of
They say
clouds.
corona, yeah. Do you know what corona means?
No.
In Spanish? I believe it means crown.
What?
Yeah, it means crown, I believe.
I have the coronavirus.
But I could be wrong. I'll have to look it up to be sure.
I have the coronavirus.
Yeah, that's interesting that it's called that. So for today, what I want you to reflect on is, in this, they see a coming darkness. It gives them a feeling of foreboding, kind of a dark feeling that something is coming. And I think in this time where we're kind of all experiencing a moment where you can feel something coming and you can sort of see it, but you're not truly experiencing it. I think it would be good for all of us to reflect on naming those feelings, and then also making sure that we see the light and the clouds and the beautiful moon and all of the stars and the other things that are around us as well. So in your reflections, if you could, maybe include how you feel about the coming darkness, but also both in the book or in real life, and also the beautiful things that you're seeing that are not touched by that. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and I'll see you tomorrow.
So Oopsies. Bye, guys.